Okay, and now Peter Schwietzer, one of my collateral duties, I'm chairman of the Government Accountability Institute. We wanted to start an institute that could do deep dive investigations with top investigators, forensic accountants, SEC lawyers, computer science specialists, etc., to look at crony capitalism. Peter's the author of the book Throw Them All Out, New York Times #1 bestseller, the book Extortion and Clinton Cash. He's had 2 60-minute specials. Peter Schwietzer.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not very often you get introduced by the chairman of your organization, so thank you for that, Steve, very much. I want to tell you a couple of stories today. These are real stories. The first story is about 4 things. It's about uranium, it's about the Russian government, it's about $145 million cash, and it's about Hillary Clinton. Now, back in 2005, former President Bill Clinton goes to a country called Kazakhstan in former Soviet Central Asia with a Canadian billionaire named Frank Schwietzer. Frank Schwietzer wants the uranium concessions in Kazakhstan. Why is Bill Clinton there? Well, Bill Clinton tells everybody he's in Kazakhstan to work on HIV/AIDS issues. The problem is there's no HIV/AIDS issues in Kazakhstan. But what happens is this. Schwietzer wants a lucrative uranium concession worth hundreds of millions of dollars, so Bill Clinton holds a press conference with the dictator of Kazakhstan, a gentleman named Nazarbayev, who holds faulty elections, who throws political opponents in jail, and Bill Clinton praises him for his leadership and the sound management that he's given to his country. Now, at the same time in Washington, D.C., a senator named Hillary Clinton has told Kazakh authorities that she's not going to deal with them unless they give the uranium concession to Frank Schwietzer. This is important, by the way, because Hillary Clinton is on the Senate Armed Services Committee and Kazakhstan needs something from them. Well, a couple of days after Bill Clinton leaves Kazakhstan, the Kazakh government gives the uranium concession to Frank Schwietzer, and a few weeks later, Frank Schwietzer decides out of the kindness of his heart to donate $31 million to the Clinton Foundation. Now, the story does not end there. In fact, this is only the beginning of the story, because you see this Canadian company that now has this uranium concession that is highly lucrative starts buying uranium in the United States. And of course, by 2008, as they're buying this uranium, Barack Obama becomes president and Hillary Clinton becomes Secretary of State. Now, the Canadians have this Kazakh uranium concession. They've bought uranium in 5 different states in the United States. They now control half of uranium assets in the United States, and they decide that they want to sell and cash out. And who do they want to sell to? They want to sell to the Russian government, specifically to Rosatom, the Russian State Atomic Nuclear Agency. But there's a problem. There's a problem because, you see, their plan is great. They're all going to make a lot of money. The problem is because Russia is an adversary country and because uranium is a critical industry, this deal requires the approval of the federal government, including the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Now, something very interesting starts happening. Not 1, not 2, 9 shareholders in this small uranium company called Uranium One decide, out of the kindness of their heart, to donate $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. And a couple of months later, guess what? The State Department signs off and approves on the transfer of the uranium. So today in the United States, half of the reserves of uranium in this country are not owned by American companies. They're not even owned by Canadian companies anymore. They are owned by the Russian government in a deal that was approved by Hillary Clinton's State Department. Is this the kind of country you want? No, I don't think they can hear you in Washington, D.C. Is this the kind of country you want? No, it's not. Let me tell you another story. There's a European company called Ericsson. They produce a lot of telecommunications equipment, and they have this nasty habit of selling telecom equipment to countries like Belarus or Iran or North Korea. So it kind of gets them in trouble from time to time. And they actually had some problems with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. There was a State Department report that called them out on their behavior. There were actually State Department cables where the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was in contact with the Foreign Minister of Sweden, where Ericsson is located. And those letters or those communications said, hey, you need to do something about Ericsson. They need to stop selling their technology to countries like Iran. Well, there was a movement on Capitol Hill to tighten the technologies that could be sold to Iran, and this was a threat to Ericsson. So you know what Ericsson decided to do? Ericsson decided this would be an excellent time to sponsor a speech by Bill Clinton. And if you're going to sponsor a speech by Bill Clinton, you might as well go in big, right? So Ericsson had never paid for a speech by Bill Clinton before. They decided for a 20-minute speech to pay Bill Clinton $750,000, which is more than he had ever been paid for a single speech before or since. Bill Clinton gave a speech for Ericsson, and guess what happened 9 days later? 9 days later, the State Department, run by Hillary Clinton, issued a statement under her name which said, we are not going to cause sanctions to restrict the behavior of Ericsson. We're going to ask Ericsson to police themselves. Problem solved. So let me ask you, is this the kind of country you want? It's not the kind of country you want, but it's the kind of country that we increasingly have, because here is what the Clintons have done in a magical and sinister way. If you look at the debate of politics in America today, there's all kinds of disagreements about whether we should restrict campaign contributions, what those restrictions could be, but I've yet to find anybody who thinks it's a good idea to allow foreign governments and foreign companies and foreign individuals to donate to campaigns. In fact, a couple of years ago, thank you. A couple of years ago, the United States Supreme Court heard a case by two Canadians who wanted to declare unconstitutional a law that said only U.S. citizens could contribute to political campaigns. The Supreme Court, as you all know, you're very astute, is deeply divided. The Supreme Court came back 9-0 and said, no, it makes complete sense. We don't want foreign governments and corporations contributing to political campaigns. Well, here is the brilliance and sinister nature of what the Clintons have done. They created an apparatus for self-enrichment by setting up the Clinton Foundation and by Bill Clinton hitting the lecture circuit that has allowed them to take tens of millions of dollars from foreign entities and to do so, and I'll put this in quotation marks, legally. I don't think it's legal because I think it's bribery, and I think it's something that should and perhaps may be prosecuted in the months ahead. But here's the bottom line. The Clintons, since Bill left office, have made more than $160 million. Much of it has come from the darkest corners of the world. And the speaking fees that he gets, by the way, are enormous, more than any other president. But it's also tied to the power that Hillary Clinton exercised as a senator and as Secretary of State. And if you need no further proof than this, consider the following fact. That is, from late 2008 to early 2009, Bill Clinton's speaking fees to overseas companies and overseas governments went up by 300% overnight. Now, what happened in 2008 to 2009? Did he get 3 times more eloquent? Did he get 3 times smarter? Did he get 3 times better looking? No. His wife became Secretary of State. And when you look at the big paydays that Bill Clinton has as speeches, that is speaking fees where he's paid $500,000 or more per speech. That's only happened 13 times in his speaking career. 11 of them occurred in the 4 years that his wife was Secretary of State. Think about that for a second. Serious payday. So where does that leave us? That leaves us in a situation today where we have massive enrichment by the Clintons, and they have created a model, by the way, that if it's not dealt with, is going to be imitated by others. Because I can tell you, I've studied and investigated corruption in Washington, D.C. for more than a decade, and I'll tell you this. It doesn't matter whether a person's a Republican or a Democrat. You show a politician a way to get rich legally, and they are going to take it. And that's really the challenge. So where does that leave us today? Well, it leaves us in a very stark situation. What kind of country do we want in the future? I'll tell you the way the country is headed right now with a very, very interesting statistic that the media doesn't seem to want to cover and nobody wants to pay attention to. And that is the decline of America into the bowels of increasing corruption. There's an organization based in Switzerland called Transparency International, and what they do is they go around the world and they look at countries to try to determine how corrupt they are. And what do? They go to businessmen and they do surveys and say, how bad is it to do business in this country? Well, you can imagine countries like Nigeria don't do very well. You can imagine countries like Colombia don't do very well. They have political cultures that can be highly corrupt. But at the top, you look at the industrialized countries. That's the United States, that's Japan, and that's Europe. In 2009, when Barack Obama became president, the United States was in the middle among industrialized countries in perceived corruption. We weren't the best at dealing with corruption, but we certainly weren't the worst. By 2012, do you know where we dropped to? By 2012, after 4 years of Barack Obama, we are now dead last among industrialized countries in perceptions about how corrupt we are. That is not a place we want to be. That is not a place we want to be. So what does the future bear? The future bears with the Clintons and the direction that the Clintons want to take the country and their mode of operation to a direction of a third world nation. Think about what is it that separates us from countries like Nigeria or countries like Colombia. Well, certainly you can say things like language and geography, but somebody shouted here. It is morality. It is a political culture and it is a legal system and structure that says no one is above the law. No one is above the law. Now, if you go to Colombia, if you go to Nigeria, there are leaders that do corrupt things and never get prosecuted. Why? Because they are above the law. The question is the United States going to follow that model, or is the United States going to cling to the tradition that's been handed down to us from the Founding Fathers in which no man is above the law? Which brings me to the Clintons. If you look at the massive scale of self-enrichment that the Clintons have engaged in, it is impossible to come to any other conclusion, especially when you look at the timing of those payments and the actions that Hillary Clinton took as Secretary of State, to come to any other conclusion that those payments are bribes intended to take action for the benefit of the person paying the bribe. The examples, the stories that I told you earlier, are only a couple of literally dozens of these types of transactions. Now, look at some of the current political corruption cases that we have in the country today. You had Governor McDonnell of Virginia, who went to jail because he took a couple of gifts. By the way, it was legal for him to take those gifts, but those gifts were allegedly, and a jury convicted him on this, were allegedly tied to favors that were performed on behalf of the person giving the gift. Or think of Senator Menendez in New Jersey. Whatever you think about Senator Menendez politically, he is facing prosecution on similar types of charges. If you look at the behavior of the Clintons as it relates to the behavior of these two individuals that are facing prosecution and have gone to jail, there is simply no comparison. The pattern of behavior, the amount of money is tremendous. And by the way, here's the thing. The myth that the left wants to perpetuate is that, well, there's no smoking gun. There's no email that says, Hillary says, give us $10 million and I'll do you a favor. Well, the simple fact of the matter is, in the vast majority of criminal cases, that kind of evidence never exists. It didn't exist in the case of Governor McDonnell. It certainly didn't exist in the case of Senator Menendez. And in the case of Clintons, the pattern of behavior is overwhelming. So where does that leave us? That leaves us, number one, with a choice in the future. And I look at people on the political left right now, and I am convinced that part of the rise of Bernie Sanders, regardless of what you think about his politics, part of the rise of Bernie Sanders has something very clear and very direct to do, not with his policy positions, but with the fact that even people on the political left has seen and have smelled the stench of corruption taken place by the Clintons. But here's the second thing that I see. I see in polls 75% of the American people don't trust their government. Part of that's policy, part of that is self-enrichment. It's not just about the Clintons, it's about a political class that have taken over Washington, D.C. Did you know, for example, that of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States, think of this, 10 counties, the richest counties in the United States, 7 of them are counties that border Washington, D.C. Think about that. A couple of years ago, Silicon Valley, that great center of innovation in the United States, was taken over as having the highest per capita income by our nation's capital. Now, a couple of years ago, Steve Bannon and I did a film for Fox News, a 1-hour special called Boomtown, about our nation's capital. And one of the most interesting interviews, you can find this online, we went and actually interviewed a guy who sold cars at an auto dealership called Ferrari of Washington, D.C. Now, think about this for a second. We talked to him and we said, how is business? And he said, business is great. And we said, well, then the corporate headquarters must be happy. And he said, no, actually, they're not. They're not happy. And we said, what are you talking about? You're selling so many cars in Washington, D.C. They've got to be ecstatic. He said, no, here's the problem. The problem is we make our money off of financing cars. Now, when people buy it in Ferrari of Beverly Hills, they finance it. When they buy Ferraris in South Beach, Florida, they finance it. In Washington, D.C., they pay cash. That's an absolute true story. So the future of this country, yes, there is a left-right divide in this country. There are blue and there are red. But the biggest divide in this country, I'm convinced, is between the country and our nation's capital. And a permanent political class that is only interested in itself. And the next time you see fireworks that take place in Washington, D.C. between Republicans and Democrats, I'm not saying that there aren't differences between the parties, there clearly are, but I would take it as a grain of salt as to the disputes that they are having. And here's the analogy that I would give you. When I was growing up, I grew up in Seattle, I used to turn on Channel 13, and I was introduced at the age of 11 to professional wrestling. Now, as an 11-year-old boy, I loved watching these big guys hitting each other with chairs, throwing each other out of the ring, and at least for a while, I hate to break it to some of you here, at least for a while, I thought it was real. What I quickly realized is these guys don't hate each other. These guys are business partners. These guys work together. Well, when you see what goes on in Washington, D.C., I would encourage you to think that sometimes the professional wrestling that's going on between the Speaker of the House and Nancy Pelosi, maybe, just maybe, it's not actually as violent and as acrimonious as you think it is. That, in fact, it may actually be for show. And then the question becomes, who is going to tell the truth and hold them accountable? And you know what? That's going to begin with you people out here. It's going to begin with you people out here. It's not going to be done ultimately by the media. It's not going to be ultimately done by political organizations. It's only going to be done by citizens who are concerned and care about their future of the country. And for that reason, I want to thank you for being here. I want to encourage you to keep fighting. And I want to say God bless you and God bless America. Thank you.